Remember the old days of software design? You know, we were in covered wagons and we lived in caves and rode dinosaurs to work and whatever. The old days. And we've talked about this before when there was this battle when the GUI came along, where people were like, I like my command line. And some people were like, this graphical user interface is pretty nice. Well, the argument against the graphical user interface back then was it was fuzzy. It was for simpletons. It was too simplistic. It was soft. It wasn't precise. Well, that battle obviously went away. And it's not that the command line has gone away, but most people agree that for most tasks, a graphical user interface is in fact a beautifully precise, effective, and efficient tool. That argument has kind of transplanted itself today into software design in a slightly different way. And the argument is now not about command line versus a graphical user interface, but it's usability versus visual depth. And it's kind of funny, right? Like, there's no reason you can't have both. And in fact, they make each other better. There's not really a bright line between them. But for some reason, when you're focused on making your software usable, well, that gets respect. But when you're focused on making your software emotionally connect with your users, that gets short shrift. Let's take the analogy of food. If you open a restaurant and you want to serve food to your customers, you can make a dish that, well, it follows the health and safety guidelines and your workers are following the OSHA guidelines, and you can look at the USDA nutritional guidelines and make sure that those are covered, and you can make sure there's nothing poisonous or spoiled in it. It's not going to make anyone sick, and you can serve that. And yet you haven't given any time to making it delicious, making it attractive, making it something that people actually want to eat. And yet you still followed all the guidelines that people are giving you. And to us, that really is the distinction that we're making. You can make something usable, but that is really the baseline. You can follow the USDA and FDA guidelines and make it safe to eat and all that, but all you've done is make it edible. You haven't made it delicious. And if all you do is make your software usable and you don't focus on what's above that, the emotional experience, our argument is you haven't even really started to do your job. Usability is not the easiest thing to measure, but it is. We've come up with mechanisms to measure it so that we can give ourselves some solace when we put out a piece of software that we're like, okay, you know, people can discover this function, people can complete this task in a given amount of time that's reasonable, people can reuse that function over and over again once they've learned it. We measure these things, we feel good that we've done a good job making our software usable. It's harder to measure the emotional component, and I believe that that's why it gets short shrift. Because of that, because it's hard to measure, we believe that people don't want to spend as much time on it. It seems a little foofy, but to us, that doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, the time you spend with your user, right? Like, that is really what forms the relationship with them as a user, as a customer. When they see your marketing materials or see an ad or a video you make, or when they call customer service, or when they talk to a salesperson, or when they see your logo or your website or any of these things, those all contribute to their impression of your company and of you. But the thing they spend the most time with, especially over time, is the user interface of your software, is in the user experience of the technology that you've created. And far and away, that is the primary factor in determining how a user, how a customer feels about your company and about you. And making that experience one that is not just usable, but is also emotionally satisfying, is really how you define your brand, right? Your brand, even though we talked about all those components that make it up, right, that represent it, the logo, the domain name, the user interface, your brand is your values. And we use those artifacts to communicate those values, to communicate what you stand for, why you come to work every day to your customers. And that's not something you can make up. That's something that has to be genuine. It doesn't have to necessarily be what you think they want. It has to come from you. Remember that food that we were talking about, that dish that you ate at a restaurant. Do you remember it the next day, a week later, a month later, a year later? The ones that you remember for a decade, those are the ones that touched you in some genuine way that touched your soul, that you made an emotional connection with that dish, not because it didn't make you sick, not because it was nutritious, but because it touched you on an emotional level, on this fuzzy level that's kind of uncomfortable. And when it comes to software, it's the same thing. The software you fall in love with, the technology that you fall in love with, is the technology that touches you on an emotional level. Usability, it's just the baseline for your technology. Your values, your aspirations, and your dreams, that's what fills the space above.